Hello everyone and welcome to the Tank Club. Today we're going to be looking at my updated version of my dungeon tank build that is all inclusive for all classes. It's very customizable and this is for the Ascending Tide dungeon DLC that's coming out very soon. So with this build we've got a bunch of new options available. We've got new gear, we've got new skills, we've got a lot of new things that we've kind of worked into this build to optimize it even further than it has been before. So we've got a great setup that we want to show you today. And this is going to work for optimized groups. It's going to work for random groups. It's going to provide a lot of buffs, a lot of debuffs. It's going to be very easy to play. The gear is customizable. So we're going to have a selection of options of gear. And you can choose which gear you want to use. There's no one build, you have to follow a certain build. There is none of that. You can choose whatever class, you can choose whatever race. You just have to kind of work towards a similar principle to what we're going to tell you today. But you choose what gear you want to use. There's so many options that are all very similar. There is not one best setup for dungeons. There are a number of good options, and it's up to you to choose the one that works for you. So it doesn't matter if you're going to be in a group with 3 damage dealers and 1 tank, or if you're going to be in a group with a healer, a tank, and 2 damage dealers. We've got something that you can work into the build for all situations. Like I said, this is an optimized group build for 4-man content, mainly for dungeons. And there are some things that obviously you will need to change if for certain situations. So, for example, if you're going into a certain hard mode of a dungeon that's very hard, you might need to switch your monster set. You might want to use different traits of jewelry for certain situations. You might want to use a different trait on something else. This is truly optimized to the max. And so here we go, guys. Let's get into the build. So a bit about my character personally. This is a Imperial Dragon Knight tank. The reason I've gone with Imperial is just for the max health, the max stamina, and the reduced cost of abilities. Race is not a huge importance. It doesn't matter what race you've got, but some of the better ones would be Redguard, Argonian, Nord, and obviously Imperial as well. Those would be the better ones. Anything that's got sustained benefits is typically going to be better because dungeons can become quite difficult, especially if you're newer to doing them. I've personally gone with a Dragon Knight tank. Now, you don't have to be a Dragon Knight tank. We've got options. We're going to have options of skills and everything for every single class. I've gone with a Dragon Knight because I just find them really nice to play, especially for dungeon content. When you're doing dungeons, having the chains, having sustain, having igneous shield, and things like that are very helpful. So that's my reason for personally choosing the Dragon Knight tank. For my Mundus Stone, I always go with the Atronach. There's not really many other good options that are available in terms of doing dungeon content. The most important thing is typically sustain, especially if you're going in without a healer. You're going to need Magicka recovery. You're going to need Magicka because you're going to need to heal yourself. You might even be required to heal your group. So in that case, you're going to need that Magicka sustain. Other options that some people use, the Steed for the movement speed and the health recovery, not that useful in this situation. And the Lady also is another one, which for me personally, I've never needed to max out my resistances. And you it's very infrequent that you need to do so. But if you're in a very hard-hitting dungeon and you're having a really hard time, that would be potentially an option if you absolutely have to. In terms of the food, again, there isn't really many other good options. Bewitched Sugar Skulls is typically the best. Max health, stamina, and Magicka, along with a little bit of health recovery. This is the most well-rounded food to use just for tanking in general. For your potions, I just use Crown Tri-Stat potions or just regular crafted Tri-Stat potions to give me all my recoveries and all of my stats, and I save them for emergencies. So when I hit a situation where I need a burst of resources or I need a burst of health or I've got some problems, I just hit my potion and I get the benefits from that. In terms of your attributes, now these are completely customizable. Now what you want to do is you want to aim for some baseline stats. For me, I've obviously got 7 Magicka, 29 health, and 28 into stamina. But that's not necessarily going to be the best for you because it depends on your race. It depends on your gear enchants as well. So if you don't use Tri-Stat enchants and you're not on an Imperial, most likely you're going to need to adjust these around to suit your particular needs. But the general aim that I always go for, I always try and aim for 20k Magicka as a minimum. I always aim for 40k health as a minimum. And I always aim for 25k stamina as a minimum. And as you can see here, with the gear that I'm using, with the stats that I've got, I've managed to get to 22k magicka, 40k health, and 29k stamina. As you can see there, unbuffed magicka recovery is 1780. That will increase in combat, and when I use potions and things like that, this will go up. In terms of the resistances, when we buff up with our resistances, we're looking at 24,000 spell resistance and 23,000 physical resistance. That is more than enough for dungeon content as a tank. If I need to adjust things, I will. If I need to change my champion points and use some resistance champion points, I will. But I've done every dungeon hard mode in the game absolutely fine using this build. So this is fine. The main thing that you need to worry about in terms of how much damage you're taking is actually looking at your block mitigation, because your block mitigation combined with your resistances, if you block attacks, that's reducing the amount of damage you're taking. So blocking is your most effective tool for reducing damage, more so than your resistances. As you can see here, another important stat in this particular category is the block cost. 6, 7, 8 block cost. That is where we want to be at. You want to be under 750 block cost generally for dungeons. The less experienced you are, the lower your block cost needs to be. The more experienced you are, the less blocking you're going to do, so you can afford to have it a little bit higher. But generally, you want to be somewhere under 750. Okay, and then we're on to the different gear options. So, generally, when it comes to dungeon tanking, we have 9 or 10 gear sets that are actually really, really good for doing dungeons. And there's very little difference between them. And this is a question I get asked a lot. What's the best dungeon setup? And there isn't one. There's like a max optimization build, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's the best option, because it would require you to be using a light and a medium set, and you're going to have very little in the way of defense. So there's a lot of different gear sets you can use. We'll start at the top. So the first gear set is the Claw of Yolnahkriin set. Now this has always been a great set since it came out. The reason why it's so good, it's so easy to maintain the buff. It's good for you as a tank. It provides buffs for you. It provides buffs for your group. It's a nice, well-rounded gear set. And the chances are, if you are a tank, you likely already have this gear set. So you can use that. The benefits of Yolnahkriin, you can obviously use it on the body pieces, or you could use it just on the back bar if you're really good at maintaining back bar uptimes, but that's really up to you. So you could use the Claw of Yolnahkriin as one option. With Yolnahkriin, you've got the max health, you've got the minor Aegis, you've got the max stamina, and then you've obviously got the max health if you've got the perfected version. You don't need to have the perfected version, but it will help a little bit more. And then you've got the minor courage buff when you taunt the enemy. As a tank, you're always going to be taunting, so you're always going to be maintaining this buff very, very easily. The next gear set is Drake's Rush. Now, Drake's Rush is comparable to Yolnahkriin in terms of the damage increase. So, generally, Yolnahkriin will increase damage by a couple of %. But when you think about a dungeon situation, you've only got 2 damage dealers, maybe 3. So you're not increasing damage by a huge amount overall, because there's very few damage dealers. With Drake's Rush, this will provide a buff for yourself and your group. Your group needs to be kind of close though. And this is going to give you all more ultimate. So you're going to benefit from the major heroism. Now just remember, this is major heroism, not minor. This will stack with minor heroism. Major and minor heroism stack together. So if you want to use Drake's Rush, the benefit of this is it's going to give you your ultimate back faster, so you're going to be able to do more Warhorns. It also means your damage dealers are going to get their ultimates back faster, so they're going to be able to do more Destra ults or more damage ults or whatever. If you've got 3 damage dealers, it's even better because you've got 3 sets of damage ults then. If you've got if you've got a healer in your group, you're going to have a bigger Warhorn uptime. So whichever way you look at it, you're getting a DPS increase because you're able to get ultimate back faster, so you're able to drop those ultimates more often. As long as people are using their ultimates on cooldown, this is an extremely strong set. And it's great for DK tanks especially, because obviously every time you use your ultimate, you get your resources back. So it's even better if you're a Dragon Knight, but it's good for all classes. But Drake's Rush for me is one of my personal favourites. It's the one that I use on my main build for dungeon content because I just absolutely love it. And like I say, it will stack with minor heroism from Heroic Slash. It will also really improve your uptime on your decisive one-handed weapon. So in overall, you're going to get your ultimate back extremely fast, and that is great for yourself and your group. So with that set, obviously you get a max health bonus for the 2-piece, a stamina for the 3-piece, a stamina for the 4-piece, and then that major heroism for the 5-piece. And you don't need to run Drake's Rush on your front bar. It shouldn't be on your body pieces. It can be a 1-bar set. You can just back bar it. Use the staff, use the ice staff, And then every time it's off cooldown, you switch to your back bar, you bash, and that will proc it. And then you don't need to worry about it again for another 18 seconds. So really good set. That one's Drake's Rush. The next option for tank gear is a new gear set that comes out this patch. It's the Turning Tide gear set. Now, there's been some conflicting thoughts about this, but looking at it, it's excellent, especially for dungeon content. Now, in a 4-man group, you might not necessarily have a Necro. You might not have a Necromancer in your 4-man group. Even if you do have a Necromancer in your 4-man group, it doesn't mean that this set becomes useless. It just means that that Necro can use a damage ultimate, and you can actually maintain a 66% uptime with the Major Vulnerability, which is the same debuff that the Necromancer ultimate gives the Colossus. So you're able to provide that with a 66% uptime as a minimum. And it's just really strong. You can just walk into an ad pull. Once you get hit, you bash, it procs the Turning Tide set, and everything has got Major Vulnerability. You go onto a boss, you proc it. 10 seconds of Major Vulnerability, 5 seconds downtime, you proc it again. It's really, really good. It's better. It's easier to maintain the Turning Tide set in a dungeon group than it is to maintain the Colossus Ultimate, because the damage dealer is not going to be able to maintain it with a 66% uptime by themselves. So this is much, much better than having somebody actually use the Colossus Ultimate. This is a very, very strong set. It's going to be it's definitely one of the top sets to use for dungeon tanking, just because it's so reliable at maintaining the uptime. The only thing you have to remember about this gear set is, for you to proc it, you have to take a blocked hit first and then bash the enemy. So it's a really, really bad set to just back bar it. You have to front bar it. You want it on the body. You need to get hit, and then you need to bash to proc the gear set. So yeah, very strong set. For the set piece bonuses for this one, you get max health for the 2-piece, you get max stamina for the 3-piece, max health for the 4-piece, and then the Major Vulnerability debuff for that 5-piece gear set. So great set. Definitely one of the top sets that you're going to be looking to get this patch. If you don't have it, you've got to farm it. You want to go in and get this as soon as you can. Next, we've got the Vestment of Olorim. This is only really useful if you run without a healer. So if you don't have a healer, usually a healer will run Olorim or Spell Power Cure. They should be running it if you've got a healer. If you don't have a healer, that's when it becomes a good set for a tank. Now, it's a light armor set, so you will have to use the weapons and the jewelry, and it can be kind of tricky to get it because it only drops in the Cloud Rest trial. But if you are running in a group where you've got a just 3 damage dealers, then this is a buff that you really want because it's really, really strong. It is kind of nice for the tank as well, because for the 2-piece you get Magicka Recovery, we get Minor Aegis for the 3-piece, we get more Magicka Recovery on the 4-piece. For the 5-piece, obviously if it's perfected, we get increased Max Magicka, and then we give the Major Courage buff as well. We have to use things like Blockade and Caltrops to place it on our group, and that will provide a circle on the ground for our damage dealers to walk into, get up, get the buff, and then they're going to have the weapon and spell damage increased by 430. So it's a really, really strong buff. It's the strongest buff we can give in terms of weapon and spell damage, so it is really valuable. If you don't have this already, then definitely you want to use this if you don't have a healer who's using Spell Power Cure. The next gear set is probably the most important gear set, the most consistent gear set that you want to have, and that's Powerful Assault. Now, you do have to remember that Powerful Assault requires a ton of micromanagement, so if you're a new tank, it could be quite difficult. A lot of people think you need to run this only on the back bar, but actually, I much prefer to use this on the jewelry, the waist, and the hands, and that way I can maintain it on either bar. And I don't use it on the ice staff unless it's a really specific setup. So let's say you're using Turning Tide, for example, you would need to use the ice staff back bar for PA. But if you're not, then you could just use it on, like I say, the jewelry and 2 body pieces. Using 2 medium body pieces is great because obviously it reduces the cost of block through your bonuses. It gives you reduced cost of weapon abilities and things like that. So reduced cost of dodge roll. There are benefits to using 2 medium pieces. So don't worry about using the body pieces. You do have benefits from doing so. Now in Powerful Assault, you're going to get max health for the 2-piece. For the 3-piece, you're going to get max stamina. For the 4-piece, you're going to get increased weapon and spell damage, which isn't that useful for us. And then for the 5-piece, you're going to give 307 weapon and spell damage to your group. And you can maintain that by using Caltrops, by using Vigor, by using Proxy Debt. It's kind of not too bad to do it. I love using this with Caltrops because I use Caltrops throughout all of the dungeons, basically, because I like to create that AoE Major Breach and the Snare and Proc PA all in one. So I love to use that, and PA is probably one of the best sets to combine with any of the other sets for a dungeon content. Next we've got War Machine. Now this is not really a set you want to use. It's only good for boss fights, and it's only good for like really high damage groups that can really burn bosses. Now you wouldn't want to use it on the ad pulls. You'd probably want to take off War Machine during the ad pulls, put on Drake's Rush, go through the ad pulls, and then when you get to the boss, you've got your ult back like maxed out, so you can use an ult with the Warhorn maybe, provide that War Machine for a really high uptime because you've used it with a maxed out ultimate. So that is one of your options, and if you can, it's really good. If you can burn bosses in like 40 seconds, then this is a great set. You're going to get max stamina for the 2-piece, Minor Slayer, which isn't very good for the 3-piece, weapon and spell damage for the 4-piece, and then for the 5-piece, you're getting that Major Slayer for your group, which is really nice, like I say, if you really high passing group. You could also use Master Architect instead of War Machine if you wanted to benefit more from the Magicka side of things rather than the stamina. That is an option also. Next, we've got Sax Champion. Mainly, this is good for Necro Tanks. If you're doing Necro Tanking in dungeons, you can use a Colossus Ultimate. You can combine that with a Horn. It doesn't seem as useful now when we've got the Turning Tide set, though. It actually seems like a more beneficial option to use a Necro, potentially a Necro barrier with Sax Champion and Turning Tide, so that you still get the benefit of the ult, but you can use, like, you're getting 3 ults basically for the price of 1, even though it's costing you 2 gear sets to get it. So there are different ways you can work things. Sax Champion, still great for trials, not so sure for dungeons anymore. Like I say, as a Necro tank, I don't see a huge value. If you're in a group where you're really struggling, then this would be good, because you could use Sax Champion with a barrier and still get the benefit of the Major Force. That's when it becomes quite useful, is in that situation where you're having a really hard time. You could use it to still provide those benefits without losing anything too much for your group in terms of increased damage. For that gear set, you get max health for the 2-piece. For the 3-piece, you get Minor Aegis. For the 4-piece, we're looking at increased max stamina again. 5 items if it's perfected, we get stamina. And then also, when you use an ultimate, you're going to get that Major Force, no matter what the ultimate is. So, decent set for those situations where you need a bit of safety, you need a barrier. And then the final gear set is Crimson Oath. Now, the places where this is good. So, 1, if you're in a stamina group or a mixed group where you've got a stamina damage dealer or 2, this is really good. They need it to reach the pen cap. They're going to be quite a way off the pen cap if you're not using this gear set. Also, it's good for new tanks. So, a lot of people will say, is this good? I'm going to use it, whatever, and it's a Magicka group. Yes, it is good if you forget to put down Blockade, because this will cover you for you forgetting to put down Blockade. Let's say you've got your Infused Crusher on your back bar, but then you never place down Blockade, but you're still proccing Crimson Oath, you're still going to be at the pen cap. So it can be useful for newer players who forget to place Blockade and they forget to activate that Infused Crusher. It's also obviously good for ad pulls because you can't use a Crusher on ad pulls, so you're able to debuff ads more easily and reach them to the pen cap so that you can kill them faster. But generally, like I say, stamina groups, great. If you're a new tank, it's good as well to cover you for that lack of Crusher. So that's all of the gear sets. That's all of the main gear sets. And it's up to you to just choose 2 of those. There is no like right or wrong option in this situation. I've told you the gear sets. I've explained to you what they do and when they're good. You need to just pick 2 of those gear sets. Whichever combination you use, the percentage of damage increase you're going to get or the benefits that you're going to get from that gear set, there's almost no difference between like each 2 combinations. So don't worry about which gear sets you choose. They're all going to be very strong, no matter which option you go with. Just pick 2 of them. And the benefit of this as well is they're all 1-bar gear sets. So there's like, if no matter which combination you use, there's always at least one of those gear sets that is just a back bar set, which means we can bring other things into this build as well. So the next thing for the build would be to choose a monster set. So we've got 2 body pieces now. We've got two gear sets. Now we're going to bring in a monster set. Now, first of all, the best monster set is to not use a monster set. The best monster set is actually to use a 1-piece Magma Incarnate monster set. That's going to give you stamina and Magicka recovery. And you're going to combine that with the Spulder of Ruin mythic item. Now, the reason why the Spulder of Ruin mythic item is the best is because you activate it by crouching and it's there 100% of the time. Every other monster set that you could use has a downtime and the Spulder of Ruin doesn't. So it provides a consistent uptime. It's easy to activate. You don't have to do anything. And the reason you use it with one Magma Incarnate is to counterbalance the loss of resources you get by using it. So you are going to lose 210 magicka and stamina and health recovery by using the Spalder of Ruin, but Magma Incarnate is going to give you 129 back, so it's actually much less. So it's not too bad. And obviously there's only 3 people in your group that are going to benefit from it, so you only lose 3 times 70 of your stats. So it's not that bad, and it's a really good buff. It's easy to maintain, and that's why it's the absolute best out of everything. The next one is the Nazare monster set. Now, I personally think this is only really good if you're combining it with Turning Tide. Now, the reason why that is because if you time everything really accurately, you can get up to 60 seconds of non-stop major vulnerability from Turning Tide combined with Nazare. So if you proc Turning Tide, so you get the Turning Tide buff, and you bash the enemy 5 seconds into the buff, you then will be able to overlap it, and you can bash again as it ends, and then you can use a 500 ultimate Warhorn. That's going to extend the duration of your Turning Tide, and then after that, before it ends, 5 seconds before it ends, make sure you block, make sure you get your buff back, bash the boss, and then again, overlap it with another bash again. So you can proc this 4 or 5 times in a row, back to back, for a consistent uptime of major vulnerability. You can only do that with the Nazare monster set. So if you're using Turning Tide, consider using Nazare. This comes from the new dungeon, and it's a good option. In terms of general use, I think you'd be better off just using the Spalder of Ruin. And if you are using Turning Tide, like I say, this would be a really good option. And the reason why it's so good, obviously, you get max health you get max health on there, and it increases the duration of all major and minor debuffs. Like I say, there's not really it's not going to benefit you a huge amount in a dungeon situation unless you are using that Turning Tide, because that's the only real major debuff that's going to cause a lot of damage, and it's on a cooldown, so it's going to reduce the cooldown of it. It's going to bring the uptime higher, but all your other things are not really that important, but that one is very, very good. The next monster set you could use is the Magma Incarnate monster set, so the 2-piece this time. The only thing with this monster set is there are quite a few problems in terms of maintaining the uptime. So this monster set has to be procced with a single target heal, which is fine. Every single class can proc this easily. The issue is that you proc it on yourself, but then somebody needs to be stood 8 meters close to you for them to get it, because it bounces between people. It doesn't activate on everybody, it bounces between everybody. So you have to have somebody within 8 meters of you to then get the buff when you activate it, and it'll bounce to them. But then there needs to be someone 8 meters close to them for it to bounce to the next person, and then somebody 8 meters close to them. So it's easy if your group know how to stack and they're close, but sometimes if you've got 2 people opposite sides of the room, it'll bounce one way, and then it can't bounce to the other side of the room. So you'll get people missing out on the buff quite often. Like this frequently you have people missing the buff. It's also got a downtime, whereas like the Spalder of Ruin has 0 downtime. It's up there 100%, and it's a bigger buff. This is a smaller buff, and it has a downtime. So it has a 66% uptime, which is okay, but it's not as good as Spalder. You also wouldn't use this if you are using Yolnahkrin. So if you're using the Yolnahkrin gear set, they provide the same buff. Obviously, then it's not worth using it because they both provide minor courage. So it's not worth using the Magma Incarnate monster set with Yolnahkrin. A few other options for monster set. You've got Incratis, which would be okay for Magicka groups, but it doesn't provide a huge buff. Especially if you've only got 2 damage dealers, it's not even worth using Incratis. It's such a tiny, tiny buff that it provides. Now we've got other sets that are way, way better. So Incratis is not good for dungeons. It's absolutely great for trials when you've got 8 damage dealers. When you've got 2 damage dealers, not so good. It's providing almost no benefit. Another option is Tremor Scale. If you're in a stamina group, you're going to want to use Tremor Scale. Tremor Scale is important for reaching the pen cap. For a stamina group, if you don't have any stamina damage dealers, it's doing nothing. So it's not really worth it unless you've got stamina damage dealers. If you don't have a healer in your group, you might want to use Symphony of Blades to provide some group sustain. You do have to slot a heal though. You have to be able to heal your group to proc it. The best way of doing that is with the orbs. So the healing orb, you can send that through your group and that will proc Symphony of Blades. But typically, you wouldn't use this because... So yeah, Symphony of Blades is only really good for a 1 tank 3 damage dealer group. And in that case, you're going to have to slot a group heal. Finally, the Engine Guardian monster set. My go-to monster set for any situation. Any difficult situation. Any situation where I'm struggling, I always just go straight to Engine Guardian. It's the best sustain monster set in the game. It's better for DKs than every other class, but it's still useful for every class. So if you're going into a hard fight the first thing you do is you switch your monster set. The monster set has the least impact on your group in terms of what it can provide. So it's the first thing you can switch and take away if you need to, because it's going to provide benefit to yourself, especially if you need sustain, if you're dying, if you're losing all of your resources because you're blocking for too long. Try this monster set. Try this one out. Give it a go. Engine Guardian's going to be really good for that. Okay, we're nearly at the end of the options for gear. So now we've got 2 gear pieces. We've got 2 gear sets and we've got a monster set. And then next we go with a weapon set. Now, there's no reason not to use a weapon set because all of those gear sets we talked about before are all 1-bar sets. The best gear set to use on the weapon sets is the Void Bash set from Vateshran Hollows. So the sword and board from Vateshran Hollows. Since the game has been changed a couple of patches ago now, where chains no longer creates soft aggro or soft taunt of the enemies. It used to taunt enemies for 2 seconds when you chained them. Now it doesn't. So this means that ad control is much more difficult. So you do want to use the Void Bash set to get control of enemies easier and faster. So I would absolutely 100%. For me, it's the best in slot in terms of ad control. You just bring everything in, and it's very, very nice, very, very easy to do, and it's just excellent. It stacks everything. You have got to time it and be careful how you use it, because if you just walk in and use it straight away, it's not so good. If you kind of wait till enemies have come towards you a little bit and everything's in range so that you can pull everything in one go, then it's absolutely excellent. Now, obviously on boss fights, it's not really that useful. So I personally do switch between my gear sets. I switch from Void Bash over to the Puncture and Remedy set, the Master Weapons. So I'll go with the Master's One Hand and Shield when I get onto boss fights because it's just much more useful. And that's going to give you nice healing. So especially in a 3DD group when you've got no healer, the Puncture and Remedy set is going to be absolutely fantastic in that environment, in that situation. So I definitely consider that as well. And then finally, like we said, you've got Mythic Items. So you've got the Spalder of Ruin, which is absolutely amazing. It's better to use that than a monster set, personally, because it's got such a good uptime and it provides such a great buff. Combine that with One Piece Magma to counterbalance the loss of stats. The other option, if you are not using a weapon set, so if you don't have the Void Bash, if you don't have Puncture and Remedy, you could use the Death Dealer's Fate. Use the Ring. You could use a One Piece of Trainee combined with that for a little bit more health. And so there's no point in running gear sets on 2 bars if you don't need to. So you might as well still maintain the gear sets on 1 bar and then bring in the Death Dealer's Fate and take up your stats to a really, really high level so you can maybe use Infused Jewelry, for example, and then have really big stats. So Death Dealer's Fate is an option if you're not using a weapon set. And that is the options. That is all your gear options, guys. So it's up to you to choose what setup you want to use. Now I'm going to quickly show you my personal build. I've got a couple of different builds that I love to use. I'm quickly going to show you the gear set that I use, the setup that I use for when I do dungeons. And here we go. So for ad pulls, I use the Vateshran One Hand and Shield. Now, I'm on a Dragon Knight tank, so I use a charged weapon with a poison damage glyph. That's going to give me 1,000 stamina back through the combustion passive every single time I use Taunt or Heroic Slash, or when I block and I've got one of my champion points that procs it. And it's off cooldown as well. If you're on a different class than a Dragon Knight, you'd probably just use Infused with Absorb Stamina. On the shield, we've got Sturdy with a Tri-Stat Glyph. And then we go with an Ice Staff of Drake's Rush. Now, this is my ad pull setup. So I've got Vateshran, and then I've got a charged Drake's Rush staff. The enchant doesn't matter. You can use whatever enchant you want, but just, it's really important. Drake's Rush, Ice Staff, charged. Like I said before, this set, I'm going to switch my back bar. I'm going to bash to proc Drakes, and then I don't need to worry about it for 18 seconds. So I just run Drakes on my back bar. I've then got a One Piece Magma Incarnate in Heavy, Sturdy, and Tri-Stat on there. I've got Drake's Rush on the main body pieces, so the chest, the legs, and the feet, because it's heavy armor. It's all Sturdy and all Tri-Stat. I've then got one light piece with the Spalder of Ruin, and again, Sturdy Tri-Stat. This is a light armor piece. I've then also got 2 body pieces of Powerful Assault, so the hands and the waist. The hands and the waist have the least armor value, so that's the reason why I've gone with those slots, so I can max out the values of armor. So as you can see, I am using 4 heavy, 2 medium, and 1 light. There's no incentive now. You don't have to use 5 heavy anymore. Since last year, when they changed the system, you don't have to use 5 heavy. You can use 4 heavy. So I've got 4 heavy here. Ideally, if I wanted to boost up my resistances a bit more, I'd change my chest and my shield to reinforce to max out my resistances a little bit, because obviously I am on the lower end of the scale on resistances, but that's not super important. So you don't really need to worry about it too much. You also don't have to use tri-stat glyphs. I like to use tri-stat. If you can't afford tri-stat or you don't want to use them, you can obviously just adjust your attributes and use like stamina, magicka, enchants. Maybe you put all your points into health and then use stamina on the big pieces and magicka on the small pieces to get a similar result. You don't have to use tri-stat. The reason I use full sturdy is because in dungeons you've got a lot of enemies hitting you. So when you go into an ad pool, there might be 10 enemies hitting you. For every single enemy that hits me, if I've got 1,000 block cost, then I'm going to be losing 1,000 stamina for every single enemy. So that's a lot of stamina if I've got 10 things hitting me. There's not really much use in using any other trait, especially for dungeons. The only thing that I would change, like I say, would be my chest or my shield and or my shield. If I needed to boost up those resistances a little bit more, I'd change those to reinforce. But that is the only change I would make at that particular time. On the jewelry, I've got Powerful Assault. I've got 1 Infused and 2 Triune. All Magicka Recovery. And the jewelry trait's kind of up to you. Infused and Triune are probably the better 2 to go with. I wouldn't use anything else. Infused if you want more Magicka Recovery. So as you can see there, 270 Magicka Recovery on the Infused piece, and then on the non-Infused piece, 169. But my stats are boosted. That's why I've got such high stats. And having high stats is a good thing for dungeons. It's not a bad thing, because you want to hit those minimum numbers. Having more stamina means I can dodge roll, I can block, I can cast all my skills, I can run into an ample, I can use all my skills. I don't have to worry about running out of stamina. So that's why we've got those things there. Like I say, you could use 3 Infused, you could use 3 Triune. Other traits are not really worth it if you use Harmony. For example, using Harmony Jewelry only provides you a benefit once every 20 seconds when you use an Orb Synergy. And if your group's not even putting out orbs on cooldown so that you can use one every 20 seconds, it's a huge waste. Using bracing enchants is not useful on this build either, because we're using sturdy. So when you use sturdy gear, bracing enchants are very, very heavily diminished, and so you don't actually get the value that it says. So it's not worth using them. But yeah, this is my build for dungeons. Now there is a little change. If we look at this, when I switch to my boss build, there is a slight gear change, because now the changes that I've made, I've got an Infused Crusher Staff instead of the Charge Staff like I had before. And I'm also using the Master Weapons. And that is the main change, apart from the skills. And the reason I've switched things around is because I'm trying to get as many buffs and debuffs as I can. I'm trying to benefit from as many things as I can. I'm trying to give my group as much as I can for the varying situations. Okay, so that was my build. We're going to look at a couple of other gear options that you might want to go with in terms of this patch. If we're looking at the Ascending Tide DLC in particular, we've got some great options of gear for this patch. So if we're considering the gear that you might want to use that comes along with this patch, we've got the Nazare Monster Set. This is going to increase our major and minor debuff duration, which is really nice. And the reason why this is nice is when we combine it with the Turning Tide set. This is a very, very good option as well. So obviously Turning Tide is strong for newer players. It's good for groups with no Necro. It's good for a good uptime of major vulnerability. And we're able to extend this as well by using the Nazare Monster Set. So we're able to get 60 seconds back to back just by timing the procs of this gear set in combination with the Nazare Monster Set. And this just works excellently. It's not worth using Nazare for ad pulls, but for boss fights, it's going to be good combined with Turning Tide. And if we were to combine these gear sets, obviously we throw in with Powerful Assault to give a really well-rounded option for a gear setup. If you were trying to run a max optimized setup, you would consider using Powerful Assault on the body pieces. You would have to use Reinforced Chest, Reinforced Shield to get a boost on the armor side of things. You combine that with Olorim, you combine that with your weapon set, you combine that with the Spulder of Ruin if you're trying to go for maximum optimization, but it's also a risky way to play because you're using a medium armor gear set with a light armor gear set and only one piece of heavy in there. If you were in a stamina group, you probably want to go with Crimson Oath, Tremor Scale, Powerful Assault, something like that. If you're a beginner player, maybe, I mean, this isn't really aimed, this build isn't really aimed at brand new beginner players. We've got a beginner tank build on thetankclub.com that is aimed more towards those sort of players if you're newer to the game. If you do a lot of random dungeons and things like that, you could consider using Leech in Plate as an option. Now, this is something I don't advise people use because it gives you that safety net, that comfort blanket that's hard to pull away from later in the game. But if you do want to get through content a bit easier, maybe you don't have an option of running with people that you know, maybe you're stuck using the dungeon queue, then using Leech in Plate with at least one buff set would be ideal. So something like Yolnacrin Leeching is an option if you have to. And then you could also combine that in terms of monster set with Engine Guardian to give yourself a kind of fairly well-rounded option that's going to play into your hands for a very, very safe option for you. But it's not very good for your actual group. So it's something to consider, but something I don't advise 100% that you do, but it's there if you need it. Okay, we need to look at skills now. So we're looking at skills for the next part of this build. Skills play an integral part into this build and how they are used and how you use the skills and in what order. And there's different skills for bosses and ad pulls as well. So we're going to start at the top. So this is the skills that I'm using on my build. There are a few adjustments you can make for different situations as well, but we'll go over those just now. So this is an ad pull setup. This is my ad pull skill setup. First of all, obviously we've got Pierce Armor. Pierce Armor is a must-have skill just generally because it's a taunt, but it's also a huge debuff. Minor Breach, Major Breach reduces that physical and spell resistance of the enemy so that your group can do more damage. Now, in an ad pull, an important thing to note here is you're not going to physically be able to taunt 10 things with this skill. When you go into an ad pull, you can only cast one skill per second. So if you've got 8 ads, it's going to take 8 seconds to taunt each one. It's too long. So this is why we focus more on crowd control more so than taunting enemies, because it's just easier to control the enemies and hold them still than taunt each individual ad. It's just really, really difficult. It takes too long. And that's what brings us to the next skill. So our next skill is Razor Caltrops. Now the reason why we're using this, there's multiple reasons in fact. So as you saw before, I'm using Powerful Assault. Now what I do is I initiate combat and then I throw down Caltrops. I can't use Caltrops as my first skill because if I'm not in combat it doesn't proc Powerful Assault. So I have to make sure I initiate combat, usually with a range taunt, and then Caltrops needs to go down. Now the reason why we use this for proccing PA is because it's going to provide us with a snare. So to control the enemies easier, we're snaring them. We're applying a movement debuff. So you throw the Caltrops in front of the enemy, they walk towards you and walk into the Caltrops. Their movement speed is reduced by 50%. It gives you more opportunity and more time and more chances to control the ads using other sources of ad control as well. Not only that, but this is a debuff. So as we mentioned before, if we're not going to go around and taunt every single ad with Pierce Armor, we're going to be missing a lot of we're going to be missing Major Breach and Minor Breach. But we're going to recover this by throwing down Caltrops. Caltrops will cover the floor. Everything inside of it that takes damage will be hit with Major Breach. So this is area of effect Major Breach, which means our group can do more damage to ads much more quickly, much more easily, and we don't have to physically taunt everything to apply that. Next we're using Igneous Shield. Now this is a great Dragon Knight skill, and the reason for that, obviously it's a damage shield for us. 8,500 damage shield for us. A 3,400 damage shield for our group. And it also gives us Major Mending, which buffs our healing. Now, one of the main reasons why this is a great skill is it costs Magicka as well, so 3,766 Magicka. And when we look at our passives, if we look at the Helping Hands passive, when you cast a non-stamina Earthen Heart ability, we get 990 stamina back. So basically, we cast Igneous Shield, it gives us a shield, and it gives us stamina. So we're able to sustain blocking for longer periods of time because we can spam it, and we're able to get stamina back. So that's why we use it. It's just a fantastic skill for providing us with all of the things that we need. Our next skill is Green Dragon Blood. Now this is an emergency heal. This is a burst heal. It works based on missing health. So if you've only got a little bit of missing health, it's not going to heal you very much. So you need to use it for an emergency when you are super low on health. That's the whole point. When you're only missing a little bit of health, it's far better to just use Igneous Shield to shield through the damage that you've lost and just kind of wait for your healing health recovery to tick away and bring you back up to full. If you're missing a lot of health, that's when you use Green Dragon Blood. But you still want to use Igneous Shield, then Green Dragon Blood, because we get the Major Mending from the Igneous Shield, and then we cast Green Dragon Blood, and we get a nice big heal, and it's increased healing because we've got the healing buffs as well. So Green Dragon Blood, I don't use Green Dragon Blood unless I'm under 50%, well, usually under 30%. I try and wait until my health is really low, and then I use it for a real huge burst heal, and because it scales based on your missing health, and it's the missing health of your max health. The more max health you've got, the more health that's missing, the bigger heal that you're going to get back. And obviously it's 4,000 magicka to do so, so you want to make sure you can get as much benefit from this as possible. Okay, the next skill on the front bar is Power Slam. This is used mainly to proc the Void Bash set, so this is an add pull skill. We only use this in add pulls, and it's only because we're using Void Bash, which is our pulling skill, our chain skill. It's going to pull all the enemies to us. So we run into an add pull, we hit this, it pulls everything in with Void Bash. Not only that, but it will now proc, as you can see here. This ability's damage is considered bash damage and interrupts the enemy if they are casting. Not only that, it will proc your Turning Tide gear set. It will proc your Drake's Rush gear set. It will proc any gear set that requires bash to activate. So this is kind of good because we are using Drake's Rush, we are using Void Bash, and we may be using Turning Tide. So with those 3 gear sets, we can proc all 3 with 1 Void Bash, which is really, really interesting. So yeah, this skill is mainly used for that, but it is not a bad damage skill. It costs 2,100 stamina. We're going to do 7k physical damage, and when we block an attack and then bash, we actually do more damage as well. So it's not a bad actual damage skill, to be quite honest with you. But generally, this is just for add pulls. You wouldn't use this on a boss fight. Finally, on the front bar ultimate, we've got Replenishing Barrier. You could use this in an absolutely worst case scenario if you wanted to. That's really up to you. So you could use it. I don't use it really personally. I use it, it's mainly, the reason it's on the bar is for the support passives, the Magicka Raid passive giving us 10% more Magicka recovery. We obviously want to try and have a good amount of Magicka recovery, because the more Magicka we've got, the more we can heal, the more we can cast Igneous Shield, the more we're able to do all of our skills. Onto the back bar skills, we've got Inner Rage for add pulls. There is another option for range taunt, which we will be using on the boss fights, but in terms of add pulls, we won't be using it. You want to use Inner Rage for add pulls because the other option for your range taunt is Frost Clench. And the problem with Frost Clench is it immobilizes enemies straight away. As soon as you activate Frost Clench on an enemy, it will immobilize them. We do not want to immobilize enemies away from us. So sometimes you may need to try and taunt things that are at range to bring them closer. We don't want to freeze them out of group. We want to bring them into a stack. This is an add pull set. We want to bring everything into one stack, stack it all up, and hold it in place. So yeah, we use Inner Rage for range taunting if we need it. And it's also a Magicka taunt. So if you run out on stamina, you've got another option for taunting because we've got a Magicka taunt. Okay, the next skill. Very integral skill. And this is our new method of crowd control. So we've already talked about Caltrops when we go into an add pull. We put down Caltrops and the enemy is snared. They are debuffed with Major Breach. We proc Powerful Assault. We then bring in Frost Pulsar. Now what Frost Pulsar is going to do is it has an increased chance to apply status effects. And because we're going to use a charged Ice Staff in add pulls, only for add pulls, not for bosses, just for add pulls. So in add pulls, you want to use a charged Frost Staff if you can. Now what Frost Pulsar is going to do is this is going to activate frost damage to nearby enemies. It's going to apply Minor Mangle, which reduces the enemy's health by 10%. It's also going to provide minor protection to our group, which is reduced damage. So our group are going to take 5% reduced damage. But not only that, it doesn't say this in the tooltip, but this has got an increased chance to apply the Chilled effect. Now what the Chilled effect does is the Chilled effect applies Minor Maim, which reduces the enemy's damage by 5%. And this is area of effect as well. This is hitting everything that's near us. What it also means is it's going to apply Minor Brittle, which means the enemies are going to take 10% more critical damage, which is, again, very, very useful, especially for 4-man content, as an area of effect. So that's providing such a huge amount of different debuffs so far. But not only that, because the enemy's going to be chilled, that leads on to our next skill, Frost Blockade. And what this means is, we ignore everything else. You've got to put down Blockade, because we want to use this as an immobilize skill. And the reason why we're doing this is because every single class has access to immobilizations via this method. So we put down Frost Blockade, and as it says there at the bottom, chilled enemies become frozen or immobilized for 4 seconds. The only way we can achieve that consistency with the frozen enemies and the chilled effect is by putting down Frost Blockade, stacking in the enemies, and then hitting Frost Pulsar, because Frost Pulsar with the charged weapon is literally a guaranteed area of an effect chilled effect, which means all of the enemies in that area become immobilized. Another good reason to use Blockade, we're not using Blockade in ad pulls for the Crusher, the Infused Crusher enchant, which is when you do use it for boss fights for that reason. For ad pulls we don't. In the ad pulls we are going to get a 10,200 projectile shield for ourselves in our group as well. So this is a good thing, because in ad pulls there's typically archers and mages that are stacked outside of the group. By putting down Blockade, we're giving our group and ourselves a 10k damage shield to protect us against projectiles. So very, very good for that reason. So yeah, when we combine 4 main skills, we combine Caltrops for the snare and for the PA proc and for the major breach, the AoE major breach. We pull all enemies in with Power Slam and the Void Bash set. We put down Frost Blockade to set us up for immobilizing the enemies and giving us a projectile shield. Then we hit Frost Pulsar, which is going to hit the enemies with Minor Mangle, Minor Brittle, Minor Maim. It's going to immobilize them, and it's going to give our group and ourselves minor protection. So many different things are happening here with so few skills. It is crazy. The next skill is Balance, and we use Balance to sustain our Magicka. So we spend health to get back Magicka, and we've got 40k health. We can afford to lose 4,800 health for the sake of getting 3k Magicka back. What also happens with this is we get Major Resolve, which is boosting our resistances by 6k almost, and this is one of the longest. Well, this is the longest Major Resolve buff in the game. We get 30 seconds with this skill. Next we've got Unrelenting Grip. So this is your chain skill, and we need this still because sometimes there are enemies that are too far out, and when we activate Void Bash has a cooldown, so we can't then proc it again straight after. So we may have to chain in some of the enemies that got stuck a bit further out, so we can pull those in with Unrelenting Grip. We also get Major Expedition from Unrelenting Grip, which gives us a speed boost for 4 seconds, increased movement speed by 30%. If you use this intelligently, you can activate it on an elite enemy or a boss to get a free speed boost. What also happens is if we don't chain the enemy in, we get the cost refunded, which is really, really good, because obviously if you're using Silver Leash, it costs stamina, and it doesn't get refunded if you don't chain. So this is obviously the best chain skill in the game. And finally, we've got Aggressive Horn, which is our main ultimate. This is the ultimate you want to try and use all the time. We get max Magicka and stamina, which benefits us a lot because max stats are obviously very, very useful for us. It gives our group Major Force, which is going to improve the amount of damage they can do, which is obviously very useful as well because we want to kill stuff as fast as possible. What this also does for a Dragon Knight tank is it procs our Battle Roar passive, which gives us resources back. So basically, as a Dragon Knight tank, you want to be using this as much as possible. Because we're using Drake's Rush, you want to be using this on cooldown. And what this means is we've got fantastic sustain because we're using it so often. We're casting Horn. As soon as it comes up, we want to use it as soon as possible, and we're going to get all of our resources back. When we switch over to our boss setup, we've got a few skill changes to go along with the gear changes. So if you remember, the gear changes were we switched the Void Bash set over to the Puncture and Remedy set, and we changed our back bar weapon, our Ice Staff. We changed it from a charged any enchant staff on ad pulls to an Infused Crusher for bosses. And the skill changes that come along with that. So we've still got Pierce Armor. You want to use Heroic Slash, or this is like a kind of a flex slot if you want it to be. The reason we use Heroic Slash is so we can get the Minor Heroism. So Minor Heroism is one thing. We're using Drake's Rush, which gives us Major Heroism to go alongside that. They stack together. If you also use another decisive weapon, that's going to help to proc it more often. So we're going to get a ton of ultimate by combining Major and Minor Heroism. Still use Igneous Shield for the same reason. Still use Green Dragon Blood for the same reason. And then we've got our Major Flex slot. So this is where you can use a skill of your choice. Maybe it will vary depending on the dungeon that you're in. So we're using Engulfing Flames. This is going to provide a damage buff. So currently it's sitting on 5%. But basically, when we use this, it's going to apply... it's going to make enemies take more flame damage. What we've got to do, though, is like in combat, this will go up. So especially if you've got like a Templar in your group, if you're using a Horn, if you've got Yolnacrin active, if you've got PA active, if you've got all these different things buffing your weapon and spell damage up, this is going to increase. So in combat, this will probably be more like 7 or 8%. In trial situations, you can get it to 10, but generally, it's going to be for a dungeon content 7 or 8%. This is a flex slot though, so you need to switch out this skill and put on whatever you need. So you may want to use Burning Embers for boss fights for a heal over time. If you look at it, you cast Burning Embers, it lasts for 14 seconds, it does 8 ticks of healing, and it's going to heal you for 102% of the damage that you cause. It causes a decent amount of damage. It's like a 1.5k to 2k heal per second basically, which can be quite nice for boss fights, especially if you don't have a healer. This is another skill you can use. This is a group heal, so you might want to just slot this. If you've got no healer again, slot this and it will shoot out healing at people, which can be kind of nice. There might be some situations where you've got a lot of projectiles to deal with, or you want to get immunity to snares and immobilization, so you can use Protective Plate to deal with those. You could use Stone Giant for the stagger debuff on the enemies. However, when you've only got 2 damage dealers or 3 damage dealers, it's providing such a tiny buff or benefit to your group. It's such a small DPS increase, and it requires so much micromanagement. You would actually be far more better off focusing on your gear set uptimes and your other skill uptimes, making sure you've got everything active more so than using Stone Giant. Stone Giant is kind of like, especially for 4-man content, it's not really a strong buff for your group in terms of boosting their damage. It's not really worth it, but you could use it if you absolutely wanted to. Another skill is Igneous Weapons. So you could slot Igneous Weapons if you're in a beginner group and you're not sure if they're using potions. And you could use Igneous Weapons in experienced groups so that they can use Heroism Potions to get their ultimate back faster. And they're still able to get the major brutality and the major sorcery from you using Igneous Weapons. Cinderstorm is another option for a heal over time, 1,750 every second, and this ticks every second on your magicka cost. So actually, it seems like it costs nothing because your magicka recovery ticks every 2 seconds, and it's way more than the cost of Cinderstorm. It doesn't seem like it costs anything, so it's like, or it feels like a free heal over time. You put it on the ground, you put it underneath you, and you're just going to get healed. It also will heal your group as well if you need some kind of group healing. The heal isn't that strong, just remember it's 1,750 healing every 1 second. It's not a huge amount, but if you only need a small heal, a heal over time, then obviously it's a decent option. One or two of the flex skills, obviously you got Overflow and Ulta. This will give minor lifesteal, which means every time your allies do damage to the enemy, they're going to get health back, and it also provides a huge synergy to give a heal. So when you're running in a 3DD group, using Ulta is pretty important usually. As we mentioned before, if you're using certain gear sets, so Symphony of Blades for example, you need to use a healing skill, so Energy Orbs might be needed in that situation. One of the last skills in this flex slot, if you're in a really high damage situation, you're taking an absolute beating and you want to kind of try and stop it from happening, stop taking as much damage, you can slot Revealing Flare. Now this is a skill that you won't use, but while slotted you gain major protection. And if you slot this, obviously the damage that you're taking is going to be reduced. You can also swap your front bar ultimate to go with the Sigil Temporal Guard ultimate, so then you've got major and minor protection to reduce your damage by 15%. So that can be a nice option in really high damage situations. For backbar skills, for boss fights, we switch from Inner Rage to Frost Clench. The reason why is because we get Major Maim, which reduces the enemy's damage that they do to us by 10%, but it also reduces any attacks that they do to our group. It also guarantees the Chilled effect. Now the Chilled effect applies Minor Maim and Minor Brittle as well. You'd be far better off spamming this and maintaining this than you would Stagger, for example. It's much easier to do. It costs magicka, and it's really cheap in cost as well, 1,381 magicka. So you get that. It also taunts, so it is a taunt, which is really useful. So we get a taunt, we get Minor Brittle, Minor Maim, and Major Maim combined into one skill. So this is really nice for boss fights. We switch Caltrops over to the back bar. So I still like to use Caltrops even for boss fights, because in a lot of boss fights in dungeon content there are ads. And sometimes I just put Caltrops, I've got Caltrops under the boss for my powerful assault proc, and then I just chain the enemies in, or I bring the enemies in, and they stand on top of the Caltrops and they're debuffed with the Major Breach. There's some situations where you don't have time to taunt all the ads, like there's a few bosses where they're just like waves after waves of all these tiny little ads, and they just have to be cleaved down and killed really fast. You don't have time to taunt them, but if you've got your Caltrops down, they're going to be debuffed and killed faster. So it has some benefit to do that. Blockade of Frost, now we use this, we want to maintain this at 100% on the ground at all times in boss fights. We want to have it so the boss is the first person it connects with at the very front of the blockade, and that will apply your Infused Crusher. We need Infused Crusher to reduce the boss's physical and spell resistance, so we do more damage to it, and then your group are going to be able to kill it faster. So that is it's really important to do that for boss fights. We have Balance again, and then we have Chains again. Chains sometimes in boss fights there are ads that need pulling in, so we have Chains still even for boss fights. But obviously, if you're in a fight where you don't need a chain, maybe you need an interrupt instead. So maybe you've got a mechanic where a boss needs interrupting, you can just slot Crushing Shock. Sometimes in a dungeon fight, you might need to slot Efficient Purge because there might be a purgeable thing. So chains, again, is a flex slot if you're going into a boss fight where there are no ads. So you can switch it out for other things if needed. And then finally, again, we've got Aggressive Horn for the same reason as before. Get our resources back, lets us block more often because we're able to get those resources back, but also providing us with more max stats and giving our group a DPS boost. So as I mentioned before, this build is for all classes. It doesn't matter what class you're on. This build will work for your class. We're going to go over the skills quickly for every other class as well in terms of boss fights and ad pulls. So if you're on a Necromancer tank, for example, you're going to use the same skill setup. The only difference is, obviously, you're going to drop your Igneous Shield. You're going to use something like Necrotic Potency. And the reason why is Necrotic Potency is going to consume corpses on the ground and heal you for free. But it's also going to give you ultimate, so you can use your ultimate more often. So it's a very, very strong skill. It also reduces your damage taken by 3%, which isn't huge, but it's damage reduction nonetheless. So you get damage reduction, a free heal. It's a free because it's a skill that doesn't cost any resources. So it's very, very valuable, especially for dungeon content, and especially during ad pulls, because you want to be consuming all the ad corpses so that you can get your Colossus back, so you can drop it more often. Hungry Scythe would be your like-for-like heal. So the DK obviously has Green Dragon Blood, and Necro has Hungry Scythe. This is your tank heal that scales off max health. So that's what we switch to for the Necro. The other skills, obviously, we still maintain Pierce Armor, Caltrops, and Power Slam, and Barrier for the same reasons we use them on the Dragon Knight. On the back bar, all the skills are the same. All of the skills are the same. We're still using the same method of tanking in terms of using Pulsar, Blockade, Caltrops, Power Bash. The only difference, obviously, is the chain skill, because the Necromancer doesn't really have one. They do have Silver Leash. You could use Beckoning Armor if you wanted to help chaining things in which case you wouldn't need balance, so you could get rid of balance, slot Beckoning Armor, and then you've got another slot to use something else. Maybe you could use the Spirit Mender instead, and then you kind of got a bit of extra healing and a bit more, an extra corpse as well to consume for more ultimate. And then obviously for the ultimate, you could use Warhorn, but generally you might want to use Colossus. If you're using the Turning Tide set, then you don't need to use Colossus, you can use Horn. It really depends, but yeah, that's your two options for that one. When we switch to a boss setup, obviously we do the same thing again. We use Pierce Armor, we use Heroic Slash. You can maintain using Necrotic Potency because of the damage reduction, because of the free heal, because you can create your own corpses to consume to get ultimate back. We then use Hungry Scythe, and then we switch our Power Bash over to Empowering Grasp. Now this is kind of a flex slot again. You don't have to use this, but this is one of our only real buff skills that we've got. Now, usually you'll tank a boss and there'll be you, then the boss, and then your group will stack behind the boss. If that is the case, then obviously you can use Empowering Grasp towards your group and give them the Empower buff, which means their light and heavy attacks are going to do 40% more damage. So that is an option. You don't have to do that if you don't want to. You could use the Corpse Creating skill instead. And then for the back bar, it's the same thing. We're still using the same things as the DK, Destructive Clench. We've got Caltrops, Blockade, Balance, Silver Leash, and then the Colossus. Onto the Nightblade tank. The Nightblade's a little bit different. Obviously, we go with the same skills again. Pierce Armor, Caltrops. This skill is always like your self-help skill or some kind of skill to protect you or help you sustain. In this case, we've got Leeching Strikes. Leeching Strikes is going to give you stamina back, like more stamina back, and it's going to give you health back as well. It's a heal and a resource skill. When you light and heavy attack, you're going to get resources back. And it also does stamina back at the end of the duration of the skill as well. It also gives us some of the Nightblade passives that we need on the front bar, which is quite useful. Next we've got the heal skill, which is Dark Cloak. It is a heal over time. It gives us minor protection. It also procs minor resolve. It also procs major resolve, which means we don't need to use a major resolve skill because this will proc it because Nightblades have it within their passives. So we get access to that by using this skill. And this is a really good heal over time as well. You can buff it up really high. It can hit sort of 5, 6, 7k heals per second when you are buffed up. So it can be a really nice heal. And this is your tank heal because it scales off your max health. Again, we use Power Slam, we use Barrier on the back bar in a Rage, Pulsar, Blockade. Here we use Phantasmal Escape. Now you can use Mirage if you want, the other morph, to get yourself more resistances. I like to use this morph to give me immunity to snares and immobilizations, but we also get Major Evasion, which means using the unassailable CP is less effective on a Nightblade, so you might as well use something else. So get rid of the unassailable CP for the Nightblade because we don't need it. We've got major evasion at all times if we keep this skill active. So it's worth it to use this skill. It also means we don't need to use balance yet. We don't need to use balance, as I said before, because of Dark Cloak, and that procs our major resolve, so we get access to a different skill. Obviously, if you need sustain and you need magicka sustain, then slot balance as well, or the other morph would work as okay if you need it, but generally you wouldn't need it. And again, Silver Leash and Blockade. For boss fights, the only thing we switch here is obviously we switch off Power Slam because we'd take off the Vatashran one-handed shield, and instead we slot Swallowed Soul. And the reason we slot Swallowed Soul is because the Nightblade doesn't really have many group buffs. It doesn't really have anything that it can provide the group. There's not really much use towards the group. By using Swallowed Soul, we get an extra heal. We do a little bit of damage, but also there's a passive for the Nightblade which gives ultimate back by using one of the skills from this skill line. So use Swallowed Soul because it's going to give us like 4 ultimate back once every 4 seconds. So it's really, really nice to use that just for the ulti game. And then all of the other skills are pretty much the same. Obviously, we switch to Destructive Clench and Heroic Slash again. When we move over to the Sorcerer, now the Sorcerer is a bit of a challenge because it's a little bit of a pain. Because the main Sorcerer heal requires 2 skill slots, we actually start to struggle for bar space. So for the add pull setup, you'll notice that there's no major resolve skill. That's kind of okay. The Sorcerer has more max health, and that will kind of cover you a little bit because the pet's going to provide you with increased max health. Major resolve for add pulls in dungeon content isn't that useful. There are not really many adds that are going to really, really hurt that bad that you're going to really like miss major resolve. Obviously, it's ideal to have it at all times as a tank, but in this case, we just don't have the bar space. Now, you could drop something else if you really must. I personally just don't use a major resolve skill for add pulls. So as you can see, we are struggling for bar space. We've got Pierce Armor, we've got our Caltrops, then we've got Dark Deal, which is a really good skill. Now, Dark Deal is a heal, but it's not a reliable heal because it's going to drop your block when you use it, and it's also going to stop you from like bar swapping or doing things for a quick second while you're casting it. So it's a really good skill in terms of sustain because we get stamina, and we get stamina over time, which is really good. It also procs your group buff, which is going to give Minor Prophecy, which is a damage boost for magicka damage dealers. So you need to have a skill to provide that buff. The problem is obviously, like I say, it drops block. It is a heal, but because it drops your block, you could be taking damage while you're casting it, which means you've basically lost the health that you're going to get back from it. So it's not a reliable source of healing because it drops your block when you cast it. We've then got the Clanfear. The Clanfear gives us a load of different passives. We get increased max health. It's also one of the best heals in the game. Like, just by using the Clanfear, it heals for a huge amount. It's a tank heal, it scales off max health, and it heals for a lot. It can heal quite easily for 30k. It's better than pretty much every other tank heal in the game. It's just really, really good. But it's going to require 2 bar slots to use it, which is the only trouble with it, really. Then we've got Power Slam and Barrier on the back bar. If you really wanted to slot a major resolve skill, I'd probably just remove Pierce Armor, to be honest, for add pulls, because it's not an essential skill. You could just use in a Rage and then slot Balance. Pulsar, Blockade, Clanfear again, because it's got to be double barred. And then Silver Leash, because the Sorc doesn't have access to any other chain skills. When we move to our boss setup, we do bring in a major resolve skill, because it is a bit more important for boss fights. And then we just go with Pierce Armor, Heroic Slash, Dark Deal again. Clanfear again, we've got Caltrops. On the back bar, Destructive Clench, Leash, Blockade. We've got another Clanfear again, and then that's where we bring in our balance. Okay, so onto the Templar. The Templar is quite interesting. The Templars are actually really, really strong for dungeon content because of their sustain, their self-heals now, and the fact that we can do crowd control with the Templar. Now we've discovered this new method with Pulsar and Blockade and Caltrops and stuff. Now we can utilize those on every class. Templar doesn't really have anything that's missing in terms of dungeon content. So if we look at the skills, we've got Pierce Armor, we've got Caltrops, we've got Living Dark. The reason why we use Living Dark is it procs your group buff, which is minus sorcery. It's going to give you group increased spell damage. And it's also a good skill for add pulls because it's going to heal you. And the more things that are attacking you, it heals every half a second. The heal that it gives you is based on your max health. So with 40k max health, we're going to have quite a lot of healing coming in from this skill. And it's also going to snare enemies. When they hit you, it's going to snare them. So they're going to get snared, you're going to get a heal, and it's going to heal every half a second, which is just really, really good. And this easily heals for 3k per heal as well. So 6k healing per second. And like I say, if you're in an ad pull, you're getting hit by 6 to 8 things maybe. Obviously, this is going to be really, really useful. The next skill, fantastic skill again, we've got Repentance. This is going to give you all of your recoveries. Minor Fortitude, Minor Endurance, Minor Intellect, increasing the recoveries by 15%. So that's really nice, just by having it slotted. Now, the main reason we use this skill is it's free, and it's going to be a heal for us and our group. It's going to heal everybody near us for the amount of corpses on the floor. So for ad pulls, especially, this is excellent. So we go into an ad pull, enemies start to die, we use Repentance, it's going to give us a heal, and it's going to heal our group. Not only that, but we are going to get stamina back. So each enemy that we use Repentance on, every dead enemy that we use Repentance on, is going to give us 3k stamina. So that's how we sustain blocking and stuff in ad pulls, and how we sustain chaining and silver leashing and things. We sustain it because we're able to repent all the corpses and get 3k stamina per corpse back, which is just an absolutely huge amount. Obviously then we use Power Slam and Barrier on the back bar, Inner Rage, Pulsar, Blockade, Restoring Focus, really good skill. You don't have to stand inside the Restoring Focus to get the benefits of the majority of the skills. So we get Major Resolve, and we get stamina back every second, 242 stamina back every second. So you can cast this before you go into an ad pull, and you'll still get those benefits. If you want to benefit from the healing, you have got to stand in it. So you'll go into an ad pull, you cast it underneath yourself and stand inside of it, and it's going to heal you every second. And this scales off max health, so it's a really good heal because it's scaling off that 40k health that we've got. And obviously it can be buffed by healing buffs as well. So we're going to get a lot of healing from this. Like if you combine as well the fact that we've got Repentance that's going to heal us and Living Dark, combined with the option of the heal from Restoring Focus, we've got a lot of incoming healing per second. So we don't really need burst healing because we've got so many ticks of healing coming in from all these different sources. Next we've got Silver Leash, because obviously the chain situation again, and then Aggressive Horn. When we switch to the boss setup, we've got Pierce Armor, Heroic Slash. We keep Living Dark because it's our group buff, and we don't really have many other useful skills that are going to provide us with our group buff. So we just keep Living Dark on the bar for that. For a boss fight, I would switch out Repentance for Radiant Ward. The reason for that is because if there's no ads available, then Repentance isn't giving us any type of healing and any type of resources. But what will happen is, by using Radiant Ward, we're able to give ourselves a huge shield, which scales off max health, and that's going to protect us against incoming damage. Then we've got Silver Leash and Barrier. On the back bar, we go with Clench, Caltrops, Blockade. Restoring Focus. Restoring Focus is even more useful on boss fights because boss fights are typically more stationary, where you can place down the rune and you can just stand in it. On ad pulls, maybe not so much, but definitely on bosses you want to have this, and this is a good heal. When we combine Restoring Focus with our Radiant Ward, so Radiant Ward's going to shield us and protect us against damage. Any damage that we do take, we get it back. We heal through it with Restoring Focus. And then we also use Extended Ritual for another heal. So this is kind of, it's not a bad heal. And also the fact it provides us with a Purge. It provides our group with a Purify Synergy, which will purge negative effects. It also provides a bunch of different benefits from the passives as well. So it's a good skill to have just because it's activating a load of passives, for a load of Templar passives, which give us a bunch of other benefits. So we place this down, and obviously when we combine Extended Ritual and Restoring Focus as two different healing skills, we've also got Living Dark in there as another healing skill, and then we're protecting ourselves with Radiant Ward, which is a cheap Magicka-based shield. Obviously we've got a ton of survivability for boss fights as a Templar tank, and an Aggressive Horn for your ultimate. And then finally onto the Warden. The Warden, obviously we got Pierce Armor, Caltrops, Enchanted Growth, which is going to give us, and if we use it towards our group, which that's what you want to do, use it at the group to give them Minor Intellect and Minor Endurance as well as ourselves. The reason we use this is obviously to proc our group buff as well, which is Minor Toughness, which is going to increase everyone's max health, ours and our groups. So we increase everyone's max health and give them more recovery, which is very nice to have. Polar Wind is the main tank heal. It's another really good heal. It scales off max health. It's a heal for us, and it's a heal over time for us, but it also heals somebody else for a huge amount. So in dungeon content, if you want to kind of go in with 3 damage dealers, this is a really nice burst heal for if one of your damage dealers takes a big hit. You can cast Polar Wind and it'll give them a huge burst heal. So really, really nice. Power Slam again, Barrier again, on the back bar, Inner Rage, Pulsar, Blockade, Expansive Frost Cloak. You don't have to use this, but it is nice for your group to have Expansive Frost Cloak, because it's going to give major resolve to everybody within 28 meters. So it's really, really nice to have Expansive Frost Cloak for that damage reduction for your group with the extra resistances. If you don't want to use this though, obviously you'd use Balance. In terms of the chain skill, Silver Leash is useful for the Warden, but if you can use Frozen Device, if you're good at placing it, it can be quite tricky to place. It takes a bit of learning, but Frozen Device is a magicka costing skill, which is typically more useful. Silver Leash is a stamina skill, which isn't as useful and can be quite resource intensive. So try to use Frozen Device if you can, but it can be quite tricky to place it where you want it. It does take a bit of practice, but eventually you should be able to get it. In terms of the boss setup, we obviously switch the same skills. We keep that Pierce Armor, we use Heroic Slash, we've got Enchanted Growth, Polar Wind, and then Fetcher Infection. We can apply another debuff to the enemy. We're going to apply Minor Vulnerability to the enemy, and that's going to give an increase of damage to our group, instead of using Power Slam, which obviously isn't that useful on bosses. On the back bar again, Destructive Clench, Caltrops, Blockade, Expansive Frost Cloak, and Frozen Device. Frozen Device should be a bit easier to use on boss fights because you are quite stationary. You're not having to move around. There's not usually as many adds on boss fights, so it can be a bit better for that situation. In terms of the add pull skill rotation, you want to try and act, like as I said before, when you go into an add pull, you need to initiate combat. You want to throw down Caltrops and Blockade. You want to Void Bash everything on, and then you want to cast Pulsar to activate the debuff. That is how you want to use a rotation in add pulls on boss fights. You're pretty much just going through your skills and maintaining everything 100%. And play mechanics. Next, we're going to move on to champion points. Now, champion points are very, very customizable depending on your situation. So, for your green CP, obviously you want to have Breakfall, reduced fall damage, because there are situations where you get thrown in the air, you've got to jump off things. And obviously by using this, that's going to improve your chance to survive those falls and those jumps and those different things. So that's nice to have. Steadfast Enchantment is a nice one to have. Rationer, increase the duration of your food. Liquid Efficiency to potentially give you a chance to not consume a potion. You definitely want to use Steed's Blessing for dungeons. So in the phases where you're in between ad pulls or you're running towards a boss and you're out of combat, you're going to get a 20% movement speed boost. And then the other one really for dungeon content, Treasure Hunter. Obviously, if you're doing dungeons, there's a good chance you're going to need to farm gear. You want the Treasure Hunter passive to give you a chance to get better stuff from the chests. Everything else, it's really up to you what you use on the green CP. There's no must-have champion points, but it's up to you. In terms of the blue CP, you want to take obviously everything that that glows yellow. So the stuff that you don't have to slot. These are non-slottables. They're just active at all times. You don't have to slot them. In terms of your slottable champion points, you've got a few different options. So for me, I always go with Ironclad. Reduces your damage taken by direct damage by 10%. I always take that. There's a lot of very heavy hitting direct damage attacks, so it's useful. Duelist Rebuff, another one I always take. Reduce your damage taken by single target attacks. So again, there's always really high damage single target attacks, things that can one-shot you. So it's good to have this for 10% damage reduction. Reduces damage over time. Damage basically with Enduring Resolve. Again, there can be some heavy ticks of damage on certain things that really, really hurt. So this is quite useful for 10% damage reduction of that. Another one is Unassailable. Now this is probably the least effective of the damage reduction CP. So if you take a AoE damage of 10k, you're using this, 10% damage reduction, all of a sudden you're taking 9k. It's not really that useful. You'd have to be taking a huge AoE damage to justify using this, and there isn't many, not for dungeons. So this is the first one I drop when I need to slot something else. Another option is Bulwark. This is going to increase your resistances by almost 2k. For me, I don't really prioritize resistances. The only time I prioritize resistances is in fights where I'm not going to be blocking. So when you're not blocking, resistances are more important. That's the only time I might consider Bulwark, is when I know that I'm not going to be blocking or I'm taking insane amounts of damage and I want to reduce it as much as possible. Next we've got Cut and Defense. Now when the enemy hits you with a direct damage attack, The reason we use this is because it procs your weapon enchants. So if you are on a DK tank using the charged weapon, using the poison glyph, and you're standing there blocking, the enemy hits you, it procs cutting defense. That procs your weapon enchant, that procs the combustion passive. So you're going to get 1,000 stamina back when cutting defense procs and your enchant is off cooldown. So that's the main reason why this is especially good for new tanks that block too much, or if you're in a really high damage dungeon and you have to block more frequently for certain phases, you're going to get procs of your weapon enchant, which is going to give you resources back. So that's really, really nice to have. The other option is Enlivening Overflow. Now this is a 50% uptime of increased resources. Now we haven't built for this whatsoever. We're just in our normal tank build. We haven't built for it, and we're able to give 110 recovery. Now if you think about this, Sustained by Suffering CP gives 150. Rejuvenation CP gives 90 recovery. This is going to give 110. It's only a 50% uptime, but if you are using something like Symphony of Blades and you're in a 3DD group and using orbs to send through your group, this is going to provide at least a bit more sustain. So in those 3 damage dealer, 1 tank kind of groups, you may consider using Enlivening Overflow to improve sustain a bit more. And it will also give it to yourself as well. So it can be quite useful in those situations. And that is everything for your blue CP. Onto your red CP. Now this is where you have to kind of choose. What do you need? What are you struggling with? Are you struggling for sustain? Use some sustain CP. Are you struggling with the incoming damage? Use some damage reduction CP. Increased health CP. You have to kind of figure things out based on what you need as an individual, based on the situation, because there's going to be different options for different situations. But I'm going to go over the most useful ones. So obviously we've got Balanced Vitality increasing your max health. This is useful for high damage situations. So a lot of the time, having increased health and damage reduction are the 2 things you want to focus on in those situations. Fortified for increased armor. For me, not one I use very often. It's only really in absolutely insane damage situations it's worth using, which is not very often, because there's just too many red CP options that are more beneficial than this one basically. But if you need more armor, if you're not going to be blocking in certain fights, then take this if you need it. You got Rejuvenation, and it gives 90 recovery, which isn't a lot, but it's like 100% of the time, and it's guaranteed. It's always there. So if you want consistent resources, then you go with Rejuvenation. You got Slippery, which automatically breaks you free, and it like does it for free as well. It can activate every 21 seconds, so there are some situations where you get immobilized. Maybe you're not very good at breaking free. In that situation, you can use this. Also, breaking free is really expensive, so it can be nice to have Slippery to automatically break free to save you the cost of breaking free. But it does have a little delay. It doesn't instantly break free as soon as you get rooted, so you will have to wait a second or two, at which point it could be too late. So it's really up to you if that's going to be beneficial for you. You've got Expert Evasion, which is a free dodge roll every 30 seconds. Obviously, if you're in situations where you are going to roll dodge a lot, or you want to evade damage rather than taking damage, so you might have a heavy attack that you can roll dodge, then that might be the better option for you, so you take less damage. So yeah, that can be another good one. In here we've got Sustained by Suffering. This is 150 recovery, which is better than Rejuvenation. The problem is it requires you to have a negative effect active on you. Now a negative effect can just be when you get light attacked by an ad, it can apply a snare. That would be a negative effect. Negative effects are quite easy to come by. So you will get applied with the negative effect quite frequently, but it's not going to be there 100% of the time, whereas Rejuvenation is consistent and 100%. This will not be, but it will still have a pretty decent uptime because you are applied with negative effects a lot as a tank. Other things we've got here are Spirit Mastery, decreases the time to res an enemy. Now obviously if you're doing random dungeons, this might be quite useful for getting resurrections. We've got Shield Master, which reduces the cost of your damage shield abilities by 10%. For me, I would rather have reduced cost than improved shields. So if I can cast a shield more often, that can be really good. So for a Dragon Knight using Igneous Shield, for a Templar tank using Radiating Ward, this can be quite nice to reduce the cost of those shields so that you can cast them more often when you need them. If you really wanted to, you could take Bastion. This increases the effectiveness of your damage shields. Like I said before, I prefer to take the reduced cost and be able to cast my shield more often, more so than having a bigger shield, because the bigger shield isn't really that much more effective. So in the other ones, we've got Celerity. This is a really good one, especially for ad pulls. You want to have that increased movement speed by 10%. So during the ad pulls especially, you might want to use this, but on bosses, it might not be as useful, so you might want to switch it out for something else. Moving over to the side, we've got Bracing Anchor. This is one that, again, is not usually that good for ad pulls because it slows you down, and that's not something that you want for ad pulls. But on bosses, it can be really useful, especially for boss fights that are really hard hitting and boss fights where you're going to be blocking a lot. And block like where you've taken a lot of damage. So Bracing Anchor can be a good one. If you're on a class that can activate a shield, so Templar and Dragon Knight mainly, Wardmaster is another good option. The only problem is it requires you to do a lot of things. So you've got to be blocking and have a damage shield active, and then this is going to reduce your incoming damage by 10%. But it's like requiring quite a lot of things to be blocking and have a damage shield active. It means that it's not going to be as active. So like, for example, Bracing Anchor is going to be there all the time whenever you're blocking, whereas you've got to have a damage shield as well as be blocking to kind of, it's really specific in what it's requiring. So it can be a bit annoying to use this, and it might not be effective because if your damage shield gets consumed before the heavy attack comes in, but you block in and then all of a sudden it hasn't worked. So this is a good option, but it takes a bit more effort. And then obviously for your red CP, you take everything that's glowing with that yellow glow. And because those are all the champion points that you don't have to slot. They're just there. Increase max health, reduce sprint, dodge roll, and break free. Okay guys, that is everything for this dungeon tank build for the Ascending Tide DLC. If you have got any questions or you want to see this build in action, you need to check out my Twitch channel. The link is in the description below. And I stream dungeon DLC hard modes every Tuesday and Thursday evening. So if you want to come and see this build in action in dungeon content, Tuesdays and Thursdays over on Twitch, that's where you can find me. You can also come along to the Twitch streams to ask any questions, or in the Tank Club Discord. You can leave any questions in the comments below. Thank you all, everybody, for all of the support, keeping the Tank Club running. Everyone who subs and watches the videos, donates, everything, thank you very much for all your support. It means a lot, and it keeps us running. It keeps this information coming. It keeps the content going. So thank you very much for that. I appreciate you watching this video, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye for now.